There's no doubt, there is no doubt no word in the work of Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, that gathers up the core concern of his thought more than the word gift, or perhaps even more fully expressed self-gift. The text from Vatican II, to which he turns time and again to explain himself or to establish a kind of authority for some point he's trying to make, is the last part of section 24, familiar to everyone in Gaudium et Spes. Indeed, the Lord Jesus, when he prayed to the Father that all may be one as we are one, opened up vistas closed to human reason, for he implied a certain likeness between the union of the divine persons and the unity of God's sons in truth and charity. This likeness reveals that man, who is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself, cannot truly find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. Although the specific words, gift of self, do not appear as such in his principal philosophical text, Person and Act, at least as far as I was able to find, not in the index, for instance, one could reasonably argue that the phrase could stand as a sort of banner over the whole of his life and thought, for not only for the work he did as a professor of ethics at the University of Lublin, but also his writing as a poet and playwright, who meditated on this gift as the heart of the human drama, and finally his shepherding the church as Pope John Paul II, the theologian of marriage and of work. Given the centrality of this notion in his thought, it's surprising to see him appear to retract some of his claims about self-gift and concede a certain weakening of the meaning of the phrase to a colleague of his, Father Karol Meissner, in the context of a written symposium on his book, Love and Responsibility, a symposium which took place in the Annals of Philosophy of the Catholic University of Lublin in 1974. To simplify for a moment, Father Meissner claimed that it's not, in fact, possible for a person to give himself to another human being, since in the end we belong only to God. And so, to insist on this point, nevertheless, is to offend against the dignity of the human person, who is essentially incommunicable. In response, Wojtyła appears to admit that his language in this case is merely metaphorical, which would seem to mean that he's making use of poetic license, and that he did not mean to imply that any person actually does give himself in reality to another. This line of interpretation seems to be reinforced by his affirmation of the distinction proposed by another colleague in the symposium, Father Andrzej Sostek, namely that between the ontic and the moral, which is to say between being and action. By accepting Father Sostek's distinction in this context, Wojtyła appears to say that the real point of his phrase self-gift is that we're meant to act like we give ourselves, and even have a kind of experience of belonging to others, even if this is not, in fact, actually the case, ontologically speaking. The language of self-gift, in other words, is beautiful, but it's not meant to be taken as true. Is this a proper interpretation of Wojtyła? Clearly, there's a lot at stake in this question. If we accept this as a proper interpretation of a phrase that defines a basic dimension of Wojtyła's life's work, we would empty that work at a single stroke of its genuine substance. We would arguably be admitting that for all of its evident rhetorical power, his teaching is ultimately hollow. So the aim of the following presentation is to argue against this interpretation, to show that the phrase gift of self has a profound and true ontological meaning, and that Wojtyła, John Paul II, sought to express this ontological sense from the beginning of his work to the end. It's not, of course, possible to demonstrate this through an exploration of his whole body of writing, which I would not be competent to do, and as the team working on the critical edition know, he was an extremely prolific writer. Instead, we will focus on just three texts. First, we'll unfold in more detail Wojtyła's response to his colleagues in the aforementioned symposium, which is the place wherein Wojtyła faced the objection to the language of self-gift most directly. Then we'll connect the idea he presents here backwards to key passages from his earlier book, Person and Act, in order to flesh out the meaning of the phrase, and then more briefly forward to a short text from later in his pontificate, a reflection entitled A Meditation on Givenness. So, turning to the exchange between Wojtyła and Meissner surrounding love and responsibility, we can boil down the latter's, Meissner's objection to the phrase self-gift to two aspects, two basic aspects, one that we could call theological and one properly ontological. The theological dimension of the objection concerns the technical question of the proper source of the right to the use of the body of another person in the marriage contract. The language of self-gift would seem to suggest that one human being gives the rights over himself, body and soul, to another. But, Father Meissner insists, this is impossible. The human person belongs exclusively to God. If we're to conceive the use of another's body in a way that does not usurp God's authority and undermine the dignity of the person, we have to recognize that God grants rights not to the other person, per se, as an individual agent, but only to conjugal intercourse, through marriage understood precisely as a divine institution. The important point for our purposes, that's a simplification of his argument, but the important point for us is the underlying claim that spouses cannot, strictly speaking, be said to belong to each other in marriage, which is to say they cannot, in truth, give themselves to one another. One can properly give oneself, according to Father Meissner, only to God, because in the end, we already belong to God as our creator. He is, so to speak, ultimately the sole proprietor. This implies, Meissner goes on to explain, that love cannot be understood as self-gift. Love is, we could say, in my words, impotent to achieve any such effect as the ontological change of status of the person, from one who belongs essentially to himself in an exclusive way to one who belongs to another human being. This point would seem to be reinforced by the ontological dimension of Meissner's objection, which can be put quite simply and straightforwardly. The person is precisely defined as iuris sui et alteri incommunicabilis, which means to be a person, in other words, is to be under the authority of oneself alone, which entails a kind of responsibility that can never be shifted onto another or otherwise transferred. It would seem altogether tautologous to say that if a person is, by definition, incommunicable, then he cannot, in fact, communicate himself. Personal being is thus inalienable and cannot be transferred to another. Self-gift, if the self is a person, is from this perspective a straightforward contradiction. As we've already observed, Wojtyła insists on the metaphorical character of his language in this context, and he accepts the clarification offered here by his other interlocutor in the symposium, Father Sostek, to the effect that the giving of oneself to another occurs on the moral plane rather than on the ontological plane, which is to say, it is a matter of the order of action rather than the order of being. But it's crucial that we attend very closely to Wojtyła's formulations in his responses to his two colleagues. In the first place, when he concedes that his language is metaphorical, the language he specifies is not the language of self-gift simply, but the admittedly, what he admits are one-sided statements that he quotes from his own book. So, quote, love, so to speak, snatches the person from this incommunicability. He wants, so to speak, to stop being his own exclusive possession. It signified, these are other quoted passages, it signifies a certain relinquishing of that sui iuris that belongs to personhood as such. We can interpret Wojtyła in his concession to Father Meissner, I suggest, not as denying in truth that one gives oneself to another in marriage, but only that one thereby ceases to belong to oneself. These 2 points can be harmonized if we recognize the possibility of belonging both to oneself and to another at once. Wojtyła goes on to concede that human beings do not belong to each other in the manner of material property, as people appear to have thought in the pre-modern world, because that would, in fact, be beneath the dignity of the person. I actually think that point would need to be qualified in all sorts of ways. In any event, in spite of this clarification, he does not in the least attenuate the language of spouses truly belonging to each other in marriage. He can speak thus if it is possible for one person to belong to another in a mode that is other than material ownership, but nevertheless real and true. So along these same lines, when he admits a distinction between the moral and the ontological levels and concedes that the gift of self does not change the ontological status of the person, he explains specifically that he means the gift does not eliminate one's belonging to oneself. In other words, he does not deny an ontological transformation in every respect, but only the sort of change that would imply an elimination of the status of the person as iuris sui et alteri incommunicabilis. Far from insisting on the separation of the moral and ontological levels in such a way that would leave the ontological level protected from or untouched by acts of the will, Wojtyła actually spends a great deal of time insisting on the unity and inseparability of these planes, an insistence, I think, that is one of the most distinctive marks of his philosophical work from the beginning to the end. So let us sum up the response Wojtyła gives to Father Meissner's objection by saying that he does not in the least take back his affirmation that a person truly gives himself to another human being in marriage. Instead, he only clarifies that in doing so, the person who gives himself does not lose himself, which is to say that in belonging to another in this way, he does not cease to belong to himself. He does not cease to be a person. This, I think, is clearly true. But the more profound and interesting question is how and why this is the case. And posing this question brings us more deeply into the heart of Wojtyła's vision. One of the best ways to set Wojtyła's notion of gift into relief is to contrast it with another act, namely the transaction, the basic logic of which seems to inform Father Meissner's objection. A transaction presupposes essentially isolated agents who exchange some discrete thing. The thing passes from one agent to another, and when it is received by the other, it ceases to be in the possession of the first, who must therefore be compensated for the loss according to the law of justice. The agents in a transaction thus do not intermingle, we might say, except in a perfectly superficial sense, insofar as neither is present or personally involved in the thing exchanged. To propose that the self of the agent is itself the thing handed over into the possession of the other would thus appear, according to this logic, a confusion, if not a radical indignity. Only a mere thing, precisely without personal presence by definition, can be given over to the other in this way, so that to suppose that it is specifically the self which is exchanged is just to render the self a mere thing, and so no longer a person. The isolated character of the agents involved implies that the self does not belong to itself precisely to the extent that it belongs to the other. If self-belonging defines personhood, in short, personhood and self-gift, according to this logic, are fundamentally incompatible. If one makes an exception with respect to God, as Father Meissner does, it is apparently not because we allow a gift of self in this case, but only because, on the one hand, we render the act a merely transcendental reality, so transcendental that it has nothing to do with the real, in fact. And on the other hand, when all is said and done, we deny that any kind of exchange actually takes place here. I can properly give myself to God because, in truth, I'm already His. So nothing really happens there. No change of any sort takes place. Wojtyła rejects this logic, which we might say establishes a fundamental despair into the person's relation to God, precisely by deepening the notion of gift. In so doing, he overcomes the problem of turning the person into a possession through exchange, not by attenuating the gift character, but by underscoring it. Quote, "It can be said that precisely the law of the gift inscribed in the being of every person protects against the right of ownership understood in relation to the human person, ownership in this model of things. Personhood is protected not by separating the person from reference to the other, but by recognizing the gift character, the gratuity and freedom of the being of the person in this reference to the other. This gratuity enables a transcendence of any dichotomous or oppositional condition of not only agency but being, as we'll see in a moment. In this case, if Wojtyła denies that one person can belong to another as a thing, he does not at all deny a deeper sort of belonging, which is possible only to persons. Nota bene, it is not that a thing can belong more to another than a person can, because a thing lacks agency or subjectivity of its own. Instead, a thing can belong less to another, even if that other has in some sense more unilateral control over it, because only a person can give himself from his own intimate being into the possession of the other so as to form a true unity with the other. Here's a quote from Wojtyła. "The point is, the gift of one person for another person, the gift which in this case is indispensable for the union of persons, so that they, a man and a woman, constitute a particular community and unity. Christ speaks of this unity referring to the words of Genesis, so they are no longer two but one flesh. In turn, Vatican II does not hesitate to describe this unity with the phrase communio personarum. All this testifies indirectly about the meaning of spousal love and about the law of the gift, thanks to which this love, this reciprocal self-giving of persons and the reciprocal belonging to each other is possible." End quote. Personhood, as Wojtyła interprets it, intensifies both a belonging to oneself and a belonging to another in this unique exchange. In this respect, not only does a person not lose himself in giving himself in reality to another, but in fact he becomes more properly a person. It's just for this reason that Wojtyła likewise sees no tension between a person's belonging to himself and his belonging at the same time to God. Again, it's the notion of gift here that's key. He explains that because of the gift that is creation, there's no contradiction in principle between belonging fully to oneself and belonging fully to God. In fact, one may interpret the insight he proposes as identifying these two conditions as flip sides, so to speak, of the same coin. One belongs to God because God has willed man in a special way, which is just what enables man to possess himself, and therefore, as we'll see in a moment, to give himself to others. As Wojtyła puts it, quote, "Such is the person in virtue of the act of creation, thus by the will of the Creator. Being such, the person is, on the basis of that very same act and the very same will, a possession of God. He belongs to God in the ontic sense. He nonetheless belongs to him as a being who is sui juris and alteri incommunicabilis. And this belonging to God, the Creator, one could say in the status of possession resulting from the fact of being created, the human person possesses himself and determines himself." End quote. It's for this reason that Pace, Father Meissner, a person's giving himself truly to another human being, as occurs in the institution of marriage, does not in any sense remove him from God. Quite to the contrary, his thus giving himself represents a concrete way of giving himself to God. The two are simultaneous and coincident to the point of being one in the same reality. Quote, "By reciprocally giving and receiving each other, in the shared vocation of theirs and in its realization throughout their whole life, the spouses at the same time realize, together and each of them separately, that gift of the person which is directed to God alone." End quote. In a word, the notion of being his gift allows us to affirm a unity of belonging to God, belonging to oneself, and belonging to another, without eliminating the distinctiveness of each. To quote Wojtyła again, "The law of the gift, both to oneself and for others, is inscribed by the Creator himself in the being of the person, together with the fundamental law of belonging to him." End quote. To say we exist in the mode of gift is to say that we are given to ourselves by God for others. Now, it's also the notion of gift that explains the unity and distinctness of the ontological and moral levels of analysis mentioned earlier. Here we approach one of the matters that gives Wojtyła's, and indeed John Paul II's, view of the human act, and especially the act of marriage, a distinctive depth. Wojtyła John Paul II is, of course, well known for his recalling of the human person to the center of philosophical and theological reflection. And along with this, his foregrounding of subjectivity, lived experience, and the conscious and deliberate exercise of the will in the human act, as we've been hearing. This latter point, in particular, marks a clear step beyond the personalism of Max Scheler, and it's arguably one of his most significant contributions, specifically in phenomenology. It would be tempting, thus, to interpret his interest in gift as a function of just this deliberate act of will in the experience of efficacity. Giving is an action, and the reflection on gift belongs principally to the field of morality. It indicates a particular kind of behavior defined by the sort of freedom possible only to a self-conscious, self-determining creature. As he says repeatedly, only one who possesses himself as a self-conscious person does is able to give himself. Well, all of this is true, or at least not false. It has to be acknowledged that for Wojtyła, the notion of gift concerns the ontic as much as the moral level, to use Father Sostek's terms. Wojtyła speaks regularly of, quote, "the law of the gift inscribed in the very being of the person." He seeks in the text we've been discussing to explain, quote, how the being of the person and the law of the gift inscribed in it are related to each other, end quote. In this context, he makes reference to the metaphysical question of, quote, what ultimately determines the person, substance or relation, end quote, and indicates the importance of this question without entering into a detailed analysis of the matter, either here or, unfortunately, anywhere else at all. We do not have the space to enter into it ourselves, you'll be relieved to hear, though it's worth referencing my father's work on this theme in John Paul II, I think, and more generally to suggest that, to my mind, one of the most satisfying responses can be found in the thought of Ferdinand Ulrich, on whom my father draws, in his interpretation of Wojtyła. But however that may be, there are obvious principles that Wojtyła does establish clearly, and there's a response to the question he himself implicitly gives, an attention to which serves to set a certain arc in his work into relief. We must note, first of all, that in the expression, the law of the gift, law can be interpreted in two fundamentally different senses, which we may designate generally as ancient and modern. According to the latter, law is a purely positive expression of an essentially arbitrary will, which seeks to impose order on essentially indifferent and unordered matter. According to the former, by contrast, law indicates an intrinsic logos, a fundamental order which is meant to be taken up and enacted by the will through the intellect, wherein it receives a properly formal expression. There can be no doubt that Wojtyła has the second sense in mind. He does not mean to present being as so much raw material, meant to be used, so to speak, by the self-determining person as the stuff of generous action. Instead, for Wojtyła to say that, quote, the law of the gift is inscribed in the very being of the person, end quote, is to say that the generosity of personal giving already begins in the being of the person. So that, and this is the key point, the act of will is not to be understood as the introduction of a meaning that was previously absent, but instead as the recapitulation of a movement of an order and meaning that is already present and in some sense underway in the being of the person. This is why the person is able to give the whole of himself, which is to say to include human being from its deepest ground in his act of will. And this is also why we can preserve a unity between the moral and the ontological orders, even in their distinctness, a unity that we've seen is of prime importance to Wojtyła. So let's, at this point, turn to consider Wojtyła's account of human action, person, and act, briefly, specifically with our foregoing theme in mind. In that text, Wojtyła, of course, analyzes the distinctiveness of the human will and its act, both from a metaphysical and from a phenomenological perspective, foregrounding it, as we know, in part because it was just this dimension that he had found lacking in Max Scheler's ethics. One of his principal intentions in this book is to demonstrate, to bring to a certain experiential clarity or Leibniz, the capacity for self-determination that can belong only to the person. A self-determination that comes to expression in the transcendence of human action, guided by conscience, that is, an insight into the truth of the good, as we have heard. Now, I think that one can certainly raise a question about whether the great emphasis that Wojtyła lays on the self-determining character of the will as a kind of precondition for self-gift would finally require a complementary emphasis on the gift character of being as a precondition for self-determination. But there is one thing that is in any event very clear in this book. Wojtyła seeks to show that the whole of the person is gathered up in action, the integration that we heard about earlier. That the will does not simply determine itself as spiritual power in its operation, but rather it determines more than itself. It determines the whole person, body and soul, from its very being. Quote, when I act, Wojtyła writes, italicizing this sentence in order to give it particular emphasis, then I am already wholly in my action. In this dynamization of my own I, to which I efficaciously contributed. I think that's really a key sentence. This point comes to expression in his analysis in Person and Act in three ways. Perhaps most importantly, it comes to expression in his regular insistence that the dynamism of the will does not originate simply in its conscious and deliberate exercise, but instead originates from the being, the esse of the person. This is the robust reading he gives of the scholastic axiom, operare sequitur esse. It is not just that operation comes after being, sequitur, so that being, in a sense, sets the prior conditions and limits the possible actions that can follow, but rather the activity itself of the operation flows from the activity already begun in being. Thus, he explains in this text that to say that human action has a natural dimension indicates not only the scope of that action, but also its fundamental mode. So the word nature, he explains, is derived from natus, nascor, to be born. And birth, Wojtyła says, is, quote, the same as coming to existence, for it contains, in a sense, the first and fundamental dynamization by esse, by existence, from which the entire secondary dynamism of operare will result, including, of course, the operation of the will itself. Quote, the first and fundamental dynamism of any being originates from its existence, from esse. Second, because the deliberate movement of the will draws, so to speak, on a source that lies deeper than itself, namely being, it takes up into itself the factors of its existential condition. This means that the act of will integrates positively into itself the promptings from things that lie outside of itself, the motions stirred in it by what is other. These include, for example, the essentially passive, or perhaps better receptive, movements of desire as responsive to values, the passions or emotions, and the whole world of what lies below the sphere of explicit consciousness. We heard about the subconscious earlier. These things all contribute to an activity that is already underway in the self prior to one's self-enactment. According to Wojtyła, these dimensions are not left out of the personal actus humana, as they are arguably for Kant, nor are they included only something like data points to be taken into consideration one's choices. Instead, they're integrated as part of the will's own movement, integrated in the will's movement. Third, even the physical reality of the body has a proper, indeed indispensable place in human action. It's well known that Wojtyła emphasizes the transcendence of the person in action, which is to say the person's self-possessive capacity to determine himself over and above all other contributing determinations, apart from the determination of truth, as we've just heard. But the sign of this transcendence, as Wojtyła conceives it, is precisely its integration of the whole of man, body and soul, down to his very being, esse, in the person's action. Thus, though body is radically distinct from spirit, it is not left outside of spiritual action as a merely external factor, even if one that imposes itself is indispensable. Instead, as Wojtyła puts it, quote, the human body and its visible dynamic is the terrain and, in a sense, even the means of expression for the person, end quote. In sum, because action originates not simply in the spiritual activity of the will, but in the will only as recapitulating being as the ultimate source, which is to say, only because human action originates in the esse of the person, can that action gather up into itself and so give expression to the whole of the person unto his very being. Only thus, in other words, can I say, as Wojtyła does, when I act, then I am already wholly in my action. End quote. Now, recognizing that a, if not the, fundamental thrust of person and act is to articulate a notion of action sufficient to gather up the whole person unto his very being, allows us to see the connection between this text, I think, and all of his later work on the nature of marriage. The act that institutes marriage, which is then expressed throughout the whole of the history of the two persons who live out their lives as a married couple, and all the individual acts and activities that constitute the marriage, I suggest, represents a paradigmatic fulfillment of the meaning of human action simply, as depicted in Wojtyła's book. If the whole person is, let us say, implicitly present in every human action, and thus implicated to one degree or another in the vow of marriage, and thus implicated to one degree or another in the vow of marriage, the whole person, soul and body, nature and history, self and relation to others, both before the self in the whole web of familial relations and after the self in the others that will normally arise from the marriage, is, as it were, the explicit content of the act. So you see the argument I'm making? The whole person is involved in all action, but in this particular action of vowing marriage, it's explicit. It's not implicit. It's in a way, it's explicit. So in that sense, it's a paradigm of human action. In this respect, the implicit meaning of all human action achieves a kind of completion, an ontological perfection in this particular establishment of a permanent bond between two people. We can see why the institutional and ontological dimensions are, in Wojtyła's view, essential to marriage. The self-gift in marriage is not a momentary realization, which would admit to different degrees of success, as in non-formalized acts of love. In this case, the meaning would be essentially subjective and partial, even if it has a sincere and dramatic manifestation. But the act of marriage results in an abiding state, as Wojtyła says, which reveals that the being of the person has been given. Marriage has its own existence, a kind of perfect expression of esse commune, we might say, in which the two become one flesh. Because it just is the gift of the whole being of the spouses. The institution is thus not a mere construction imposed on what would otherwise be a merely personal, perhaps very deeply felt relationship, an imposition that is due simply to the practical needs of the social order. Instead, it is a fulfillment of the law of the gift inscribed in the very being that constitutes personality. But it's not just the ontological institutional nature of marriage that flows naturally from the reality of the human act, its inner truth. In a properly qualified sense, even the sacramental character flows from the nature of that action. Man is capable of giving himself in a complete and genuinely ontological way only because his being is already gift, and his being is gift by virtue of the act of the Creator who willed him for his own sake, and by that fact willed him to will himself in an act of self-giving. In other words, he can give himself ultimately because he is given by God. One finds a surprising confirmation of the insight here in the physics of Aristotle, wherein the Greek philosopher argues that a thing can actually move itself as a whole only if it is moved by another. To encapsulate a complex argument that Aristotle makes in a simple form, to move oneself entails a division between what moves and what is moved. This division would be left in place if we thought of the activity of the will as originating merely from itself, and not also from the being that exceeds it, in which the will is grounded. As we have seen, the will can move itself, the whole of itself as person, only because being is already gift, which is to say that it can move itself only because it is simultaneously moved by another. In this case, the only other that can move being itself without, so to speak, intruding on it from the outside, namely God. It is from this perspective that we can catch a glimpse of the depths of the profound reflection John Paul II offers later in his pontificate, in which he meditates at length upon the phrase, God has given you to me, and of course me to you. Since the very beginning, the Pope says, man has been given to the other by God. Let us note that the beginning indicates creation, not as an event in history in a positivistic sense, but in the properly metaphysical sense of the beginning of being simply. In this respect, we would have to say that the deepest principle of human action, understood as having in general the essential form of self-gift, which is realized to different degrees in each instance, is not just esse, but esse specifically as gift from God. Or in other words, the deepest principle of all human acts is ultimately God himself. It is for this reason that we can understand the self-gift of one human being to another, not as a kind of theft from God, as Father Meissner worried, but precisely to the contrary, as the realization of God's generous presence. To cite again the text we heard earlier, by reciprocally giving and receiving each other in the shared vocation of theirs, and in its realization throughout their whole life, the spouses at the same time realize together, and each of them separately, that gift of the person which is directed to God alone. John Paul II, in his meditation on givenness, presents Christ's redemptive deed as God's re-giving of creation to man, which is to say a surprising recapitulation at an inconceivably higher level of the original gift of creation. Similarly, we can say that the sacrament of matrimony is a wondrous recapitulation of the fact that in marriage, simply, God has given you to me and me to you, and that this deep truth resonates with a kind of nostalgic beauty through all properly human activity. Sacramental matrimony is thus a fulfillment of the proper natural form of marriage in a way that is analogous to marriage being the fulfillment of human action generally. The truth of marriage is thus worth defending, among other things, because what is at stake is the meaningfulness of every human act, its reality as an expression of self-gift in which the very being of persons is implicated. If Karol Wojtyła, the phenomenologist of human action, became John Paul II, the great defender of marriage, it is no doubt in part because he saw the crisis of meaning as the great affliction of our age.